The mountain man, known as Owen Pierce, stood over the crumpled form in the snow, his breath clouding in the bitter Colorado morning as he wondered if the small figure was already dead. It was January 1878, and he had been checking his trap lines in the high country near Kennewick when he spotted the dark shape against the white expanse. His massive frame, hardened by years of survival in these unforgiving mountains, moved with surprising speed as he dropped to his knees beside what he now saw was a young woman. Her lips had gone blue, her dark hair matted with ice, and her clothing was completely inadequate for the mountain winter. She wore a thin dress that might have been suitable for warmer climates, torn and filthy from what must have been days of wandering. Her feet were wrapped in rags. Owen stripped off his thick bearskin coat without hesitation and wrapped it around her slight frame. She was alive, barely, her breathing so shallow he had to press his ear close to her face to hear it. He gathered her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, which compared to his 220 pounds of solid muscle, she practically did. His long, dark hair whipped around his bearded face as the wind picked up, warning of another storm approaching. His cabin was 2 miles away, and he covered the distance in less than an hour, his powerful legs driving through snowdrifts that would have stopped most men. The woman in his arms never stirred, her head lolling against his broad chest. When he finally kicked open the door of his log cabin, the warmth from the banked fire hit him like a wall. He laid her carefully on his bed, the only bed in the single-room structure, and immediately set about building up the fire. He had seen frostbite before and knew the dangers of warming someone too quickly. He rubbed her hands and feet gently, trying to restore circulation, and wrapped her in every blanket and fur he owned. Then he heated water and made a weak broth from dried meat, hoping she would wake enough to take some. It was nearly nightfall when her eyes finally opened. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with terror when they focused on him. She tried to scramble away, pressing herself against the log wall, and began speaking rapidly in a language Owen had never heard before. It was not Spanish, which he knew a little of from trading with Mexican trappers, and it was not any native tongue he recognized from his years in the mountains. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, trying to show her he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said in his deep, rumbling voice. "You are safe. I found you in the snow." But she clearly did not understand a word. She continued speaking, her voice rising in pitch, gesturing at herself and then toward the door. Tears began streaming down her face as she spoke, and Owen felt a strange tightness in his chest at the sight of her distress. He pointed to himself. "Owen," he said clearly. "Owen Pierce." She stared at him, still frightened, but she had stopped trying to escape. He pointed to himself again. "Owen." Understanding flickered in those dark eyes. She pointed a trembling finger at him. "Owen," she repeated, her accent making it sound like Owen. He nodded encouragingly and then pointed to her with a questioning look. She hesitated, then pressed her hand to her own chest. "Rosa," she said softly. "Rosa Sokolov." The name sounded Eastern European, though Owen could not have said which country exactly. He knew there had been immigrant families trying to settle in Colorado, drawn by promises of cheap land and opportunities. Most were unprepared for the harsh reality of frontier life. He wondered what tragedy had left this Rosa Sokolov alone in the mountains in the dead of winter. "Rosa," he repeated, and she nodded. He pointed to the cup of broth he had prepared. "You need to drink." She did not understand his words, but she understood his gestures. She took the cup with shaking hands and sipped carefully. The warmth brought color back to her cheeks, though she was still far too pale. She drank it all and handed him back the empty cup with what might have been a grateful look. That night, Owen made himself a bed on the floor near the fire while Rosa slept in his bed. He did not sleep much, listening to her restless movements and occasional murmurs in that strange language. He found himself wondering about her story, about how she had come to be alone and freezing in his mountains. More than that, he wondered about her voice, the melodic quality of those foreign words. He wanted to know what she was saying, what thoughts moved behind those frightened eyes. The next morning, Rosa was stronger. She sat up in bed, clutching the blankets around herself, and watched Owen move about the cabin preparing breakfast. He was aware of her gaze on him as he worked, conscious of his size and rough appearance in a way he had not been in years. He lived alone by choice, finding the company of other people exhausting after the war. But this woman's presence in his cabin did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like something else entirely, something he was not ready to name. He brought her a plate of fried salt pork and cornbread, and she ate hungrily. When she finished, she pointed to herself and then mimed washing dishes. He shook his head, but she insisted, standing up from the bed. Her legs nearly gave out, and he caught her before she could fall. For a moment, they stood very close, his large hands steadying her slim frame. She looked up at him, and he saw something other than fear in her eyes this time. Curiosity, perhaps. Maybe even gratitude. Over the next few days, they established a careful routine. Rosa regained her strength, and Owen watched the color return to her face and the life come back to her movements. She tried to help with every task, clearly uncomfortable being waited on. He taught her simple English words by pointing at objects and naming them. Cup, plate, fire, snow. She repeated each one carefully, and he found himself looking forward to these small lessons, to the sound of her voice wrapping around English syllables. But he wanted more than simple nouns. He wanted to know her story. He wanted to hear her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. The desire surprised him with its intensity. He had not wanted anything beyond basic survival for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly want something. On the 5th day, he made a decision. He pulled out a worn notebook and pencil from his supplies, something he had not touched in months. Rosa watched with interest as he sat at the rough wooden table and began to write. He pointed to her and then to the notebook, indicating she should write her language. Her eyes widened in understanding. She took the pencil with careful fingers and began to write. The letters looked nothing like English, all strange curves and marks. But beneath each word, he had her say it aloud, and he wrote the English sound phonetically. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, building a basic vocabulary list of her language, Russian. That was what it was. She was from a place called Saratov, a city on a great river. She had come to America with her parents and younger brother 2 years ago when she was 18. They had traveled west seeking farmland, joining a small group of other Russian families. But their settlement near Kennewick had been struck by disease in the fall. Her father had died first, then her mother, and finally her little brother. Owen pieced this story together over several days through their growing shared vocabulary, through her gestures and drawings, and through the tears that fell when she spoke of her family. The other families had moved on, afraid of the disease spreading further, and they had left her behind believing she was also sick. She had recovered, but found herself alone with no money and no way to communicate with the English-speaking townspeople. She had tried to walk to another settlement, had gotten lost in the mountains, and would have died if he had not found her. As she told him this, communicating through their patchwork of Russian and English words, Owen felt anger kindle in his chest. How could they have abandoned her? But he said nothing of this. Instead, he made a promise to himself that he would take care of her, that she would never be abandoned again. The lessons became the center of their days. Owen threw himself into learning Russian with the same fierce determination he had once applied to surviving in the wilderness. Rosa was a patient teacher, though sometimes she laughed at his pronunciation, a sound that made something warm unfold in his chest. Her laughter was like water in the desert, rare and precious. He taught her English in return, and she proved a quick student. Within 2 weeks, they could have simple conversations, mixing both languages freely. He learned that she loved to sing, that her mother had taught her dozens of folk songs. He learned that she missed the steppes of her homeland, the wide open spaces that reminded her of these Colorado mountains. He learned that she was 20 years old, that she could read and write in both Russian and a little German, that she dreamed of having a home again. And she learned about him. He told her things he had never told anyone, speaking in his rough Russian that made her sometimes smile and gently correct him. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, about fighting in the war, about the things he had seen that made him flee to the mountains to live alone. He told her about the nightmares that still woke him sometimes, about the silence he had craved after years of cannon fire and screaming. "But now," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, speaking in careful Russian, "silence is not good." He looked at her, at the way the firelight played across her face, at the intelligence and kindness in her eyes. "Now," he replied slowly, "I think maybe silence is not what I need anymore." February arrived with more snow, but the cabin remained warm. Owen's trap lines were neglected, as he spent his days learning Russian grammar, practicing conversations, reading aloud from her few precious possessions that had survived her ordeal, including a book of Russian poetry. His deep voice stumbled over the words at first, but Rosa helped him, and gradually the language began to feel natural on his tongue. One night, she asked him to read her favorite poem. It was about a birch tree standing alone in a field, dreaming of palm trees in distant lands. As he read, his accent improving with each line, he saw tears slip down her cheeks. When he finished, she spoke to him in Russian, the words flowing freely. "I was that birch tree," she said, "alone and dreaming of home, but now I think maybe I am finding new roots." His hand reached across the space between them and took hers. Her fingers were small in his calloused palm, but they gripped him firmly. "Rosa," he said, still in Russian, "you do not have to be alone anymore. You can stay here as long as you want, forever if you choose." "Forever," she repeated, testing the Russian word on her tongue. Then she said it in English. "Forever." The winter days grew longer, and so did their conversations. They talked about everything and nothing, switching between languages as they chose. Owen found that some things were easier to say in Russian, that the foreign words gave him courage to express feelings he had kept buried for years. He told her she was beautiful, that her presence had brought light back into his dark world, that he was falling in love with her voice and her spirit and everything she was. Rosa's cheeks would flush when he said such things, but she did not pull away. She began touching him more freely, her hand on his arm when she laughed, her fingers brushing his as they passed things at the table. And she began speaking to him in Russian about her own feelings, how she felt safe with him, how his strength made her feel protected, how she had begun to imagine a future she thought was lost to her. "I thought I would die alone," she told him one evening in March as they prepared dinner together in the small cabin. She spoke in Russian, the words coming easier than English still. "I thought God had forgotten me. But then there was you, this giant man from the mountains, and you cared enough to learn my language just so you could hear what I had to say. Do you know what that means to me, Owen?" He turned from the stove, his large frame filling the small space, his long hair tied back from his face, his dark eyes intense. "Tell me," he said in Russian. "I want to hear you say it." She stepped closer to him, tilting her head back to look up into his bearded face. "It means that you gave me back my voice when I thought I had lost it. It means that you saw me as a person, not just a burden or a problem. It means that I have fallen in love with you, Owen Pierce, and I do not know what to do about it." His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their size and roughness. "You do not have to do anything," he said, his Russian heavily accented but clear. "Just let me love you back. Let me take care of you. Let me hear your voice every day for the rest of my life." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long exile. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she had to stand on her toes even then to reach him properly. He lifted her easily, his powerful arms encircling her slim waist, and she made a small sound of surprise and pleasure against his mouth. They parted, both breathing hard, and Rosa laughed softly. "We should have done that sooner," she said in English, the words still carrying her thick accent. "We had to be able to talk first," Owen replied, also switching to English. "I needed to tell you properly how I feel, in your words, so you would know I meant it." "I know you mean it," she said, touching his face wonderingly. "You learned an entire language for me. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You listened to my grief and my fears, and you did not turn away. How could I not know you mean it?" As spring approached, they made plans. Owen would take Rosa to Kennewick once the passes cleared, and they would be properly married. She worried about how the townspeople would react to her foreign ways and her accent, but Owen promised her that anyone who treated her poorly would answer to him. His reputation in these parts was solid, he explained. People knew him as a fair man, but not one to cross. "Besides," he added in Russian, making her smile, "I can tell them in their faces that you are my wife, and they will respect you or else." "You mean to their faces," she corrected gently. "Yes, that," he agreed, pulling her close. "My Russian is better than my English grammar now." She laughed and kissed him again. These kisses were becoming frequent, stolen moments throughout the day when they would pause in their work to embrace, to whisper words of love in two languages, to simply hold each other. Owen had never imagined himself capable of such gentleness, but with Rosa, it came naturally. She brought out a side of him he thought the war had killed. In April, the snow finally melted enough for travel. Owen packed supplies and saddled his horse, a sturdy mountain mare named Belle. Rosa wore a dress that Owen had purchased from a traveling peddler months ago, intended as a gift for some unnamed future occasion. It fit her well enough, and she looked beautiful in the deep blue fabric. The ride to Kennewick took most of a day, with Rosa sitting in front of Owen on the saddle, his arms around her as he controlled the reins. She leaned back against his broad chest, feeling safe and warm despite the cool mountain air. They practiced English as they rode, Owen testing her on vocabulary, Rosa correcting his grammar. Their laughter echoed off the mountain peaks. Kennewick was a small town, barely worthy of the name, consisting of a general store, a saloon, a church, and perhaps 24 scattered buildings. The townsfolk watched with open curiosity as the mountain man rode in with a woman in his arms. Owen ignored the stares and headed straight for the church. The minister, Reverend Thomas Hayes, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who had known Owen for several years. He listened as Owen explained the situation in his straightforward way. Rosa stood quietly beside him, her hand clasped in his much larger one, trying to understand the rapid English conversation. "So you want to marry this young lady," Reverend Hayes said, looking between them. "And she speaks no English," "She speaks some," Owen corrected. "She is learning, and I speak Russian now. We understand each other just fine." The Reverend raised his eyebrows at this. "You learned Russian?" "Yes. That is quite a commitment for a woman you have only known a few months." Owen's jaw tightened. "I know what I want, Reverend. I want to marry Rosa and build a life with her. Will you perform the ceremony or not?" Rosa tugged on Owen's sleeve, confused by the tension in his voice. He turned to her and explained in Russian what was being discussed. Her eyes widened and she looked at the Reverend nervously. "Tell him," she said in Russian, "that I will be a good wife, that I will learn English properly, that I love you and want to marry you." Owen translated, and something in his voice when he spoke those words must have convinced the Reverend. He smiled and nodded. "Very well. We can perform the ceremony today if you would like, but we will need witnesses." This proved easy enough. The store owner and his wife agreed to stand as witnesses, curious about the mysterious woman the mountain man wanted to marry. Within an hour, Owen and Rosa stood before the altar of the small church, holding hands as Reverend Hayes performed the marriage ceremony. Owen had quietly asked the Reverend to go slowly so Rosa could understand some of it. When it came time for the vows, Owen spoke his in English first and then repeated them in Russian, looking into Rosa's eyes as he promised to love, honor, and protect her for all his days. She repeated the vows back to him, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, speaking in Russian and then carefully in English. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance. The witnesses clapped politely, though they clearly did not know what to make of this strange marriage. After the ceremony, Owen purchased supplies at the general store, including fabric for new dresses for Rosa, more books to help with her English, and various household goods. The store owner's wife, Martha Collins, spoke to Rosa in slow, careful English, and Rosa responded as best she could. Martha seemed charmed by the young Russian woman's efforts and invited them to visit whenever they came to town. As they rode back toward the mountains, Rosa wore a simple gold band on her finger, purchased from the store's limited jewelry selection. She kept looking at it, touching it as if to make sure it was real. "Are you happy?" Owen asked in Russian. "Yes," she replied, then in English, "Very happy." "You are good man, Owen. Best man." "The best man," he corrected automatically. "The best man," she repeated, and then added in Russian, "My man." Their life together settled into a comfortable rhythm as spring turned to summer. Rosa worked on improving her English, reading aloud from books while Owen worked on expanding the cabin. He was building another room, explaining in Russian that they would need more space eventually. She understood his meaning and blushed, placing a hand on her still flat belly. It was too early to know for certain, but she suspected new life was already growing there. Owen proved to be an attentive husband in every way. He was gentle with her despite his great strength, always careful, always making sure she was comfortable and happy. At night, they would lie together in the darkness, and he would speak to her in Russian, whispering words of love and desire that made her heart race. She would respond in kind, sometimes teaching him new words, more intimate words that made his eyes darken with passion. During the days, they worked side by side. Rosa learned to help with the trap lines, to cure hides, to garden in the thin mountain soil. Owen taught her to shoot, placing the rifle in her hands and standing behind her, his arms around her as he showed her the proper stance. She learned to fish in the cold mountain streams and to identify edible plants. She was determined to be a true partner to him, not a burden. In the evenings, they continued their language lessons, though these had evolved into something more like conversations now. They would discuss their dreams for the future, the children they hoped to have, the life they were building together. Sometimes Rosa would sing to him in Russian, old songs her mother had taught her, and Owen would listen with his eyes closed, the words washing over him like a blessing. By midsummer, Rosa's pregnancy was confirmed. She told Owen in Russian, the words tumbling out in her excitement, and he swept her up in his arms with a shout of joy, spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. Then he set her down gently as if she might break, his large hands spanning her waist as he knelt before her. "I will take care of you," he promised in Russian. "Both of you. I will build you the best cabin in Colorado. I will hunt and provide. You will want for nothing." "I want for nothing now," she replied, running her fingers through his long hair. "I have you. That is everything." As her belly grew, Owen became even more protective, insisting she rest often, bringing her water and food, rubbing her feet when they swelled. He finished the new room just as the first snows began in October, creating a proper bedroom separate from the main living area. He also built a cradle from smooth pine wood, carving it with intricate designs during the long evenings while Rosa sewed tiny clothes. They still spoke primarily in Russian to each other, though Rosa's English had improved dramatically. It had become their private language, the tongue of their love and their intimate moments. When they were in town, they spoke English, and Rosa was learning to navigate the complexities of American social customs with Martha Collins' patient help. But at home, in their cabin in the mountains, Russian was the language of their hearts. Winter arrived with heavy snows, but Owen had prepared well. They had plenty of food stored, and the cabin was tight against the cold. Rosa spent her days sewing and cooking, reading English books to practice, and talking to her unborn child in Russian, telling stories of the old country, of her parents and brother, keeping their memory alive. Owen would often place his hand on her belly, marveling at the movements of the baby within. "He is strong," he would say. "He kicks like a mule." "Maybe she is strong," Rosa would counter. "Maybe she will be strong like her father." "Strong like her mother," Owen would reply. "You are the strongest person I know, Rosa. You survived when anyone else would have died. You learned a new language in a foreign land. You made a home in these wild mountains. Our child will be strong because you are strong." The baby came in late February, during a snowstorm that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Owen had been worried about having no doctor or midwife, but Rosa remained calm. She had helped deliver babies back in Russia and knew what to expect. She guided him through it in Russian, her voice steady even through the pain, telling him what to do and when. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, Owen caught the tiny body in his large hands and felt tears stream down his face. A son. They had a son. Rosa took the baby to her breast, exhausted but smiling, her hair damp with sweat. "What should we call him?" she asked in Russian. Owen looked at the small face, the tiny features that somehow already seemed to combine his and Rosa's characteristics. "What was your father's name?" he asked. "Dmitri," she said softly. "Then Dmitri it is, Dmitri Pierce." The baby nursed hungrily and Rosa laughed softly. "He has your appetite." "He has your beauty," Owen countered, touching the baby's dark hair gently. "And I hope he has your heart." Those first weeks with the baby were exhausting but joyful. Owen proved surprisingly adept at infant care, his large hands somehow perfectly gentle as he changed and held his son. He would walk the cabin floor at night when the baby cried, singing Russian lullabies that Rosa had taught him in his deep, rumbling voice. The baby would often calm at the sound, and Rosa would watch from the bed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Spring came again, and with it, the melting snow and the return of life to the mountains. Owen took Rosa and baby Dmitri to Kennewick to show off their son. The townspeople cooed over the baby, and Martha Collins threw a small celebration at her home, inviting the few other women in town to meet Rosa properly. Rosa had been nervous about this, worried her English would fail her, or that the women would look down on her foreign ways. But she need not have worried. The women were kind, asking about the baby and about life in the mountains. Rosa answered their questions as best she could, mixing English and hand gestures when words failed her, and they seemed charmed by her efforts. One of the women, Sarah Mitchell, asked how Owen and Rosa communicated with Rosa's limited English. Rosa smiled and replied in careful English, "He learned my language, he learned Russian for me." The women looked astonished. Sarah turned to Owen, who was in the corner with the men, holding his son proudly. "Is that true, Owen? You learned Russian?" Owen looked at Rosa across the room, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable. "Yes," he said simply. "I wanted to hear what she had to say." The women sighed collectively at this, and Martha patted Rosa's hand. "You have a good man there, dear, a very good man." "I know," Rosa said, her English clear and firm. "The best man." Life continued in this pattern through the following years. Every few months, they would make the journey to Kennewick for supplies and to maintain their ties to the community. Rosa's English improved until she was nearly fluent, though she never lost her accent. The townsfolk grew accustomed to the mountain man and his Russian wife, and more than one person remarked on how much happier Owen seemed now, how the dark shadows that had once haunted his eyes had lifted. At home, they still spoke Russian to each other most of the time. It remained their intimate language, the words of their private world. They taught Dmitri both languages from birth, speaking to him in Russian and English interchangeably. The boy grew strong and healthy, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's sturdy build. When Dmitri was 2 years old, Rosa told Owen she was pregnant again. This time, there was no surprise, only quiet joy. They had hoped for more children, wanted Dmitri to have siblings the way Rosa had once had. Owen built another addition to the cabin, creating a second bedroom, and Rosa sewed more baby clothes during the long winter evenings. Their daughter was born in September, during the golden days of early autumn when the aspen trees turned the mountainsides to gold. She came into the world with less drama than her brother, arriving quickly and easily as if eager to join the family. They named her Alina, after Owen's mother, and she had her father's light brown hair and her mother's delicate features. Dmitri was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly and showing her his toys. Owen would sit with both children in his lap, these two small lives that he and Rosa had created together, and feel a contentment he had never imagined possible. The lonely mountain man who had fled human company now found his greatest joy in his family, in the sound of children's laughter and Rosa's voice singing as she worked. As the children grew, the cabin filled with life and noise. Dmitri was energetic and curious, always asking questions in his mixture of Russian and English. Alina was quieter but intensely observant, watching everything with her serious eyes. They played together in the meadow near the cabin during summer, building imaginary fortresses and chasing butterflies. In winter, Owen would take them sledding on the gentle slopes, their shrieks of delight echoing across the snow. Rosa bloomed in motherhood. The girl who had nearly frozen to death alone in the mountains was now a confident woman, strong and capable, running her household with efficiency and filling it with love. Her English was now as good as her Russian, and she often served as a translator when they encountered other immigrant families in the area. Several Russian families had settled near Kennewick over the years, drawn by word that one of their own had made a success of life in Colorado. Owen had kept his promise to provide for his family. The trapline brought in steady income, and he had expanded into trading, using his connections throughout the mountain region. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, They were happy. The cabin had grown over the years, now a proper home with multiple rooms, glass windows, and even a few luxuries like Rosa's treasured samovar for making tea, purchased on a trip to Denver. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Owen surprised Rosa with a gift. He had secretly commissioned a Russian-language Bible to be sent from the East, knowing how much she missed having religious texts in her native language. When she unwrapped it and saw what it was, she burst into tears and threw her arms around him. "How did you find this?" she asked in Russian, holding the book to her chest. "I wrote to a bookseller in New York," he replied in the same language. "I described what I wanted and he found it for me. It took almost a year to arrive, but I wanted you to have it. I wanted you to be able to read the words that comfort you in the language of your heart." She kissed him deeply, mindless of the children playing nearby. "You are always thinking of me," she said, "always finding ways to show your love." "Because I love you more than anything," he said simply. "You saved me, Rosa. I was half dead when I found you in that snow, dead inside even if my body still walked around. But you brought me back to life. Learning your language, hearing your voice, falling in love with you, it all healed something in me I thought was broken forever." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "You gave me a reason to live when I thought I had lost everything. You gave me a home, a family, a future. We saved each other, my love." The years passed with the gentle rhythm of seasons and growing children. Dmitri learned to trap and hunt with his father, his small hands learning to set snares and read animal tracks. Alina helped her mother in the garden and the kitchen, learning to preserve food and sew clothing. Both children were fluent in Russian and English, switching between languages without thought, and they were being taught to read and write in both. Owen and Rosa would sometimes lie awake at night after the children were asleep, talking quietly in Russian about their blessings, about how far they had come from that frozen morning when he had found her. They made love in those quiet hours, their passion for each other undimmed by years of marriage, speaking words of love and desire in the language only they shared in such intimate moments. When Dmitri was 7 and Alina was 5, Rosa became pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Owen worried constantly. He made her rest often, took over more of the household tasks, and watched her with anxious eyes. But Rosa remained calm, trusting her body and God to see her through. The baby, another boy, arrived in March after a long labor that left Rosa exhausted but triumphant. They named him Peter, and he was small but healthy, with bright blue eyes that surprised them both. Owen's mother had had blue eyes, and apparently that trait had been lying in wait to emerge. 3 children made the cabin feel full and alive. There was always someone needing attention, always laughter or crying or the sound of small feet running. Owen built another addition, creating a larger space for the boys to share since Alina would need her own room as she grew older. The cabin was now quite substantial, a far cry from the single room where Owen had lived alone for so many years. Rosa sometimes marveled at the life she had built. When she had left Russia, she had dreamed of a new life in America, but had never imagined anything like this. She had pictured a small farm, perhaps, a simple life, maybe a husband if she was fortunate. Instead, she had found Owen, this massive mountain of a man with his gentle heart and his fierce determination to learn her language so he could truly know her. She had found a love story that still made her heart flutter when he looked at her in a certain way. The children kept them busy for years. Dmitri grew tall and strong like his father, his shoulders broadening as he reached adolescence. Alina became beautiful like her mother, with the same dark eyes and graceful movements. Peter was the most adventurous of the 3, always climbing trees too high or exploring too far from the cabin, giving both parents gray hairs. Owen taught all three children to respect the mountains, to understand the dangers and the beauty of the wilderness. He taught them survival skills, how to find water and shelter, how to read the weather and the land. Rosa taught them to read and appreciate literature, to understand history and culture. Together, they created well-rounded children who could move between worlds, equally comfortable in the rough mining camps and in polite society. When Dmitri was 15, a group of investors came through Kennewick looking for guides to take them into the high country in search of mineral deposits. Owen was recommended as the best guide in the area, and he took Dmitri with him on the expedition. It was the boy's first real job, and he came back 2 weeks later taller somehow, more confident, with money in his pocket and stories to tell. Elena, at 13, was already drawing attention from the young men in Kennewick. Owen watched this with mixed feelings, protective of his daughter but knowing he could not keep her a child forever. Rosa counseled patience, reminding him in Russian during their private evening conversations that Elena was sensible and well-raised. She would make good choices when the time came. Peter, at 8, was the entertainer of the family. He had inherited something of his parents' gift for language and could mimic accents perfectly, delighting his siblings by imitating the various people they met in town. He made Rosa laugh until tears streamed down her face with his performances, and even Owen's stern expression would crack into smiles at the boy's antics. Through it all, Owen and Rosa remained each other's anchor. They still held hands as they walked, still stole kisses when the children were not looking, still retreated to their bedroom to be alone together and speak words of love in Russian. The passion between them had matured but not faded, deepening into something richer and more complex than the initial flush of romance. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, they would sit together by the fire, Owen reading aloud from Russian novels to keep his language skills sharp, Rosa correcting his pronunciation when needed, but mostly just enjoying the sound of his deep voice wrapping around her native tongue. Sometimes she would teach him new words, more subtle concepts, poetry and philosophy that expanded his vocabulary beyond the practical. "You speak Russian better than some Russians I knew," she told him one evening as they sat close together, her head resting on his massive shoulder. "I had a good teacher," he replied in Russian, kissing the top of her head. "And strong motivation. I wanted to hear your voice, remember? I wanted to understand every word you spoke, every thought in your head. Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Learning a whole language, marrying a foreign woman, all the complications I brought into your life." He turned to face her, his hands cupping her face as he had that first time he kissed her, years ago in this same cabin. "Rosa, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Before you, I was just existing, hiding in these mountains from a world that had hurt me too much. You gave me back my life. You gave me purpose and love and a family. How could I possibly regret any moment of it?" She kissed him then, deeply, and they remained on the couch long into the night, holding each other and talking quietly about everything and nothing, the way they had since the beginning. As the children grew older and more independent, Owen and Rosa found themselves with time alone again. Dmitri was working as a guide regularly now, saving money and talking about his own future. Elena was helping Martha Collins in the general store, learning the business and the social skills that would serve her well. Peter was usually off with friends from town, exploring and getting into minor trouble as boys do. Owen took advantage of this freedom to take Rosa on trips into the mountains, just the two of them, like they had done before the children. They would pack supplies and disappear for days, camping under the stars, making love in hidden meadows, and talking for hours in Russian about their lives, their memories, their hopes for the future. On one such trip, they climbed to a high peak that offered views for miles in every direction. They stood together looking out over the vast wilderness, Owen's arms around Rosa from behind, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You ever miss Russia?" he asked in Russian. She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I miss my family," she finally said. "I miss my parents and my brother. I miss some of the foods and some of the traditions. But do I miss Russia itself? No, this is my home now. These mountains, that cabin, you and our children. This is where I belong. I am glad," he said simply, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are as necessary to me as air or water." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his bearded face. His hair was starting to show gray now at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there when they met. But to her, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, still her mountain man who had learned Russian just to hear her voice. "And you are everything to me," she replied. "My protector, my love, my heart. You took a girl who was lost and alone and gave her a reason to live. You learned my language when you could have just taught me English. Do you know what that meant to me? It meant that my voice mattered, that my thoughts and feelings were important enough for you to meet me halfway. It meant that I was valued, not just as a woman or a wife, but as a person with my own history and culture." "Of course you were valued," Owen said, looking confused. "How could you be anything else? Many men would not have seen it that way," she said gently. "Many men would have expected me to simply adapt, to give up my language and my ways and become American. But you did not ask that of me. You learned Russian and you taught me English, and you let me keep my identity while building a new life. That is a gift, Owen. That is love." He kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her mouth. "I love you, Rosa Pierce. I have loved you since I first heard you speak, since I first decided I needed to understand those words, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." They made love there on the mountain, under the wide blue sky, with no sounds but the wind and their voices murmuring words of love in Russian. Afterward, they lay together on the blanket Owen had spread, Rosa's head pillowed on his broad chest, his fingers running through her hair. "We should go back," she said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "The children will worry." "The children are fine," Owen replied. "They are practically grown now. Let us have one more night out here, just you and me." So they stayed, watching the sun set in a blaze of color, then watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Owen pointed out constellations and told her their names in English, and she told him the Russian names for the same star patterns. They compared the stories attached to each constellation, finding similarities and differences in how their cultures had interpreted the heavens. "We are not so different, your people and mine," Rosa observed. "We look at the same sky and see many of the same things." "All people are the same at the core," Owen agreed. "We all want love, safety, purpose. We all fear death and seek meaning. The language and customs change, but the human heart is the same everywhere." The next morning, they reluctantly packed up and made their way back to the cabin. They arrived to find controlled chaos. Alina had burned dinner the night before, and the boys had attempted to fix it, resulting in a kitchen that looked like a tornado had struck. But everyone was safe and happy, and they greeted their parents with enthusiasm. "Did you have a good trip?" Dmitri asked in English, though he switched to Russian to add, "We managed not to burn down the cabin." "Barely," Alina added in Russian, rolling her eyes at her brothers. Peter just grinned and hugged his mother, switching fluidly between languages as he described their misadventures. All three children were perfectly bilingual, though they tended to use English in public and Russian at home, following their parents' example. The years continued their steady march. Dmitri met a girl in Kennewick, the daughter of a rancher, and began courting her seriously. Her name was Ann Porter, and she was a practical, kind woman who quickly won over the family. She did not speak Russian, but she asked Rosa to teach her a few phrases so she could greet Dmitri's mother properly. Rosa was touched by this gesture and took the girl under her wing, teaching her Russian cooking and some basic vocabulary. Anne proved an apt student, and while she never became fluent, she learned enough to follow conversations and participate in family dinners. When Dmitri announced his engagement, Owen sat his son down for a serious conversation. "Are you certain about this?" he asked in Russian, their private language for important discussions. "Yes, father," Dmitri replied in the same language. "I love Anne and she loves me. She is strong and practical and she will be a good partner." "Marriage is more than love," Owen said, drawing on his own experience. "It is commitment and work. It is choosing that person every day even when things are hard. Are you ready for that?" "You and mother make it look easy," Dmitri observed. Owen laughed. "It is not easy. Your mother and I work at our marriage every day, but it is worth the work. She is worth every effort." He paused, then added, "Make sure you learn to really listen to your wife. Learn her language, even if it is the same as yours. Learn how she thinks, what matters to her, what her words really mean. That is the secret to a good marriage." Dmitri nodded thoughtfully, understanding the deeper meaning behind his father's advice. Owen was not talking about Russian and English, but about truly knowing another person, about caring enough to bridge the gaps in understanding. The wedding was held in Kennewick's church, the same church where Owen and Rosa had married nearly 20 years earlier. Rosa cried happy tears as she watched her eldest son pledge his life to Anne, and Owen held her hand tightly throughout the ceremony. Afterward, there was a celebration at the Porter Ranch, with food and dancing and much merriment. Owen and Rosa danced together, moving slowly despite the lively music, wrapped in their own world. "Our baby is married," Rosa murmured in Russian against his chest. "He is not a baby anymore," Owen replied in the same language. "He is a man and a good one. We raised him well." "We did," she agreed. "All three of them are good children. We are blessed." Within the year, Alina began seriously courting a young man named William Scott, the son of another mountain family. He was quieter than Dmitri, but solid and hardworking, and he treated Alina with obvious respect and affection. Owen approved, though he struggled with the idea of his daughter marrying and moving away. Rosa gently reminded him that this was the natural order of things, that children grew up and started their own families. Peter, now a teenager, showed an interest in becoming a teacher. He loved languages and learning, and the small school in Kennewick needed someone who could help immigrant children adapt. Rosa encouraged this dream, recognizing in her youngest son the same desire to bridge cultures that she had experienced. Owen was less certain but trusted Peter to make his own choices. Owen and Rosa were in their 40s now, their hair showing gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and occasional worry. But they were healthy and strong, and their love for each other had only deepened with time. They still began and ended each day in each other's arms, still spoke Russian to each other in private moments, still found reasons to laugh and make love and simply enjoy being together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Owen took Rosa back to the place where he had found her all those years ago. The clearing looked different in summer, green and lush instead of frozen and dead, but she recognized it immediately. She stood in the spot where she had collapsed in the snow, where she had been certain she would die alone and forgotten. "I was so scared," she said softly in Russian. I could not feel my hands or feet anymore. I remember thinking that this was the end, that I would freeze to death, and no one would ever know what happened to me. Owen came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. But then a very stubborn mountain man found you, he said into her hair. And he took you home and decided he needed to learn Russian immediately because he was already falling in love with you. She laughed and turned to face him. You were not falling in love with me yet. I was half dead and terrified. I was absolutely falling in love with you, he insisted. The moment you said your name, the moment I heard your voice, I knew I wanted to hear you speak for the rest of my life. Everything after that was just details. You are a romantic, she teased. Only with you, he replied seriously. Only ever with you. He had brought champagne, purchased in Denver at great expense, and 2 tin cups. They toasted each other there in the clearing, remembering the past and celebrating the present. Then they sat on a blanket, and Owen pulled out a letter he had written in Russian, carefully composed over several weeks. I wanted to tell you what you mean to me, he said, suddenly nervous despite 2 decades of marriage. And I wanted to do it in your language, the way I should have done it at the beginning. He read the letter aloud, his voice steady despite his emotion. He talked about the day he found her, about his decision to learn Russian, about falling in love with her voice before he even understood her words. He described the joy of their first conversations, the wonder of hearing her thoughts and dreams in her native tongue. He talked about their children, about building their life together, about how she had healed his war-wounded soul and given him a reason to rejoin the world. By the time he finished, they were both crying. Rosa took the letter from him with trembling hands, pressing it to her heart. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me, she whispered in Russian. I will treasure this letter forever. I love you, Rosa Sokolov Pierce, he said. I love you in Russian and in English. I love you in every language that exists. And if I had 1,000 lifetimes, I would spend every one of them learning how to hear your voice. They held each other in that clearing, in the place where their story had begun, and Rosa reflected on the strange path her life had taken. She had left Russia seeking a better life and had lost everything. She had nearly died alone in the cold. But then Owen had found her, and instead of just saving her life, he had learned her language so he could truly know her. He had given her back her voice when circumstances had stolen it away. That night, back in their cabin, they made love with the tenderness and passion that still characterized their relationship. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Rosa spoke softly in Russian. You remember teaching me English words, she asked. How you would point at things and name them. Of course, Owen replied in Russian. You were so determined to learn quickly. I was determined because I was falling in love with you, she admitted. And I wanted to be able to tell you in your language, but I have always been grateful that you learned my language first. It meant I could tell you my whole story, all my grief and fear and hope, in the words that came naturally to me. I am glad too, he said. I got to know the real you, not some simplified version limited by language barriers. I got to hear your voice, your actual voice, not just the words you could manage in English. They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had for 20 years, and as they would for many more years to come. Elena married William in the spring, in another beautiful ceremony that had Rosa crying and Owen looking stern to hide his emotion. Peter, now 16, served as an usher and charmed all the guests with his easy manner and multilingual skills. Dmitri and Anne attended with their baby daughter, Owen and Rosa's first grandchild, a tiny thing named Sarah who had her grandfather's eyes. Owen held his granddaughter carefully, his large hands gentle as he had learned to be so many years ago with his own children. He spoke to her in Russian, the language of his heart, telling her stories about her grandmother's homeland. The baby cooed and grasped his finger with her tiny hand, and Owen felt his eyes grow damp. "Another generation," Rosa said softly, standing beside him. "Our family grows." "Thanks to you," he replied. "You gave me all of this. Family, love, purpose. Everything that matters." Over the next few years, more grandchildren arrived. Alina had twin boys, causing much excitement and chaos. Peter went off to a teaching college in Denver, determined to get proper training so he could open a school that specifically helped immigrant children. Dmitri and Anne had another child, a boy they named Owen after his grandfather. Owen and Rosa settled into the role of grandparents with grace and joy. They loved when their children brought the grandchildren to visit, filling the cabin with noise and laughter once more. Owen would take the older grandchildren into the mountains, teaching them the skills he had taught his own children, while Rosa would bake with them and tell them stories in Russian and English. The grandchildren grew up bilingual like their parents, learning Russian from their grandmother and English from everyone else. It became a family tradition, this linguistic heritage that Rosa had brought from the old country, and that Owen had embraced so completely. The family was known in Kennewick as those bilingual Pierces, and they wore the label proudly. As Owen and Rosa entered their 50s, their pace slowed somewhat. Owen's knees ached on cold mornings, a legacy of years in the mountains. Rosa's hands sometimes troubled her when she sewed, arthritis creeping into her joints. But they remained healthy and active, still working their land, still making the trip to town regularly, still very much in love. They took to spending evenings on the porch that Owen had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and red. They would hold hands and talk about their day, about the grandchildren, about memories from their long life together. Sometimes they spoke in English, sometimes in Russian, often mixing both languages in the same sentence, so natural had the bilingual life become to them. "If I died tomorrow," Rosa said one evening in Russian, "I would die happy. I would die knowing I was loved completely." "You are not dying tomorrow," Owen said firmly in the same language. "We have years yet. I refuse to let you go." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I am not planning to go anywhere. I am just saying that you gave me a beautiful life, Owen Pierce. More than I ever dreamed of when I left Russia. More than I thought possible when you found me in that snow. We gave each other a beautiful life," he corrected. "I was as lost as you before we met, just in a different way. We saved each other." On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party in Kennewick. The entire town attended, testament to the respect and affection the community had for the mountain man and his Russian wife. There were speeches and toasts, and Dmitri spoke movingly about his parents' love story, about how his father had learned an entire language just to truly know his mother. "That is what love looks like," Dmitri said to the gathered crowd. "It looks like being willing to learn, to change, to meet someone where they are. My father taught me that love is not just about feeling, it is about action. He showed his love for my mother every day by speaking her language, by honoring her heritage, by making sure she never felt like she had to give up who she was." Rosa cried and hugged her son, then her other children, then her husband. Owen stood tall and proud, his arm around Rosa, accepting congratulations from neighbors and friends. Martha Collins, now elderly but still sharp, approached and hugged Rosa warmly. "I remember the first day Owen brought you to town," Martha said. "You were so scared and could barely speak English. And now look at you. You raised a beautiful family, became a pillar of this community, and kept your culture alive through your children. You should be very proud." "I am proud," Rosa replied, her English now perfect despite the lingering accent. but mostly I am grateful. Grateful for Owen, for our children, for this life. As the years passed into their 60s, Owen and Rosa gradually reduced their workload. Dmitri took over most of the trapping and guiding business, though Owen still went out occasionally, unwilling to fully retire. Rosa passed her Russian cooking and language lessons to her daughters and daughters-in-law, ensuring the family traditions would continue. Peter had indeed opened a school in Kennewick that specialized in helping immigrant children, and it was thriving under his leadership. The cabin in the mountains remained home, though Owen had made modifications over the years to make it more comfortable. There was now a proper bathroom with a water pump, a larger kitchen with a modern stove, and comfortable furniture purchased from catalogs. But the essential character of the place remained unchanged. It was still the cabin where Owen had brought Rosa that frozen morning, where they had fallen in love, where they had raised their children. On a summer evening in 1908, 30 years after they had married, Owen and Rosa sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. They were both in their late 60s now, their bodies showing the wear of years but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. "Do you think you will learn any other languages?" Rosa asked teasingly in Russian. Owen laughed. "I think 2 is enough for one lifetime, though I have picked up a bit of German and Spanish from our neighbors over the years." "You always were good with languages once you started," she observed. "I think you have a natural gift you never knew about." "I had proper motivation," he replied. "I wanted to hear your voice. Everything else followed from that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands intertwined, watching the light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the grandchildren playing, their voices carrying on the evening air in a mixture of Russian and English. "We did well," Rosa said finally. "We did," Owen agreed. "We did very well indeed." Years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. Owen and Rosa became the heart of a large, loving family that stretched across Colorado and beyond. Peter married a fellow teacher, and they had children who became educators and translators. Alina's sons grew up to be ranchers like their father. Dimitri's children continued the guiding business and expanded it into a proper outfitting company. Through it all, Owen and Rosa remained devoted to each other. They slowed down more as their 70s arrived, but they still took walks together, still held hands, still spoke to each other in Russian in the quiet moments. The language of their hearts had not changed, would never change. On a crisp autumn morning in 1913, 35 years after Owen had found Rosa in the snow, they woke up together in their bed as they had done for all those years. Rosa's hair was completely white now, Owen's beard and hair the same. His body, once so powerful and muscular, had softened with age, though he was still strong. Her face was lined deeply, but her dark eyes still sparkled with intelligence and humor. "Good morning, my love," Owen said in Russian, his first words of every day for 35 years. "Good morning," she replied in the same language, as she always did. They rose slowly, helping each other as they had learned to do. They dressed and made breakfast together, moving around their kitchen with the practiced ease of decades of partnership. They spoke of small things, plans for the day, which grandchildren might visit, what needed to be done before winter came. After breakfast, they walked together to their favorite spot, a clearing not far from the cabin with a view of the mountains. They walked slowly now, leaning on each other for support, but they still made the trip most mornings when weather permitted. They stood together looking at those magnificent peaks that had been the backdrop of their life together. "I think I would like to be buried here," Rosa said suddenly in Russian, "in this clearing, with a view of these mountains that became my home." "Do not talk about dying," Owen said, but gently, knowing the conversation had to come eventually. "We are old, my love," she said practically. "We will not live forever. I want to make sure you know what I want." "Very well," he conceded. "Here then, and I will lie beside you when my time comes. Promise me something else," she continued. "Promise me that you will have our headstone written in both Russian and English. I want anyone who finds it to know that we bridged two worlds, that we honored both languages." "I promise," he said, pulling her close, "though I hope we have many more years before we need to worry about headstones." They did have more years, several of them. They watched more grandchildren marry, held more great-grandchildren, celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by a family so large they had to hold the celebration outdoors. Owen was 81 years old and Rosa was 78, both having lived far longer than most people did in those times. On a peaceful night in the spring of 1918, Rosa fell asleep in Owen's arms and simply did not wake up. She passed quietly, without pain, her final breath a gentle sigh. Owen held her for a long time, speaking to her in Russian, telling her all over again how much he loved her, how grateful he was for their life together, how empty the world would be without her voice. The funeral was enormous. The family had grown so large that people traveled from across the state to attend. They buried her in the clearing she had chosen, with a view of the mountains, and the headstone was exactly as she had requested. Her name in both English and Russian, her dates, and an inscription that read in both languages. She spoke, and he learned to listen. Owen stood at her grave long after everyone else had left, speaking to her in Russian, the language he had learned so many years ago just to hear her voice. He told her he would join her soon, that he could not imagine continuing without her, that their story had always been one story, not two. He lived another year, still sharp in mind but fading in body. He spent his days teaching the great-grandchildren Russian words, making sure the language did not die with Rosa. He wrote down the story of how they met, how he learned Russian, how they fell in love, wanting future generations to know. He prepared everything carefully, knowing his time was short. On a winter morning in 1919, Owen Pierce died in his sleep in the bed he had shared with Rosa for 40 years. He was 82 years old, and according to those who found him, he was smiling. The family buried him beside Rosa in the clearing, and his headstone matched hers. His inscription read in English and Russian. He listened, and he loved. But the story did not end there. The family Owen and Rosa had built continued to grow and thrive. Their descendants carried forward the tradition of bilingualism, teaching Russian to each new generation along with English. The cabin in the mountains was maintained as a family retreat, a place where grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren could come to feel connected to their roots. Peter's school became a model for immigrant education throughout Colorado. Dimitri's guiding company grew into a major business. Alina's sons became prominent ranchers who never forgot their Russian heritage. And all of them told their children the story of Owen and Rosa, of the mountain man who learned Russian just to hear an immigrant woman's voice, of the love that bridged languages and cultures and built a legacy that lasted long after both of them were gone. In the clearing where they were buried, wildflowers grew thick in the summer, and in the winter, the snow covered everything in peaceful white. The headstones stood side by side, their inscriptions in two languages testament to a love story that had honored both. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you stood very still in that clearing, you could almost hear voices on the wind, speaking words of love in Russian and English, the languages of two hearts that had beat as one for 40 years and would remain united beyond death and time. The mountain man and the immigrant girl who spoke no English had found each other against impossible odds. He had crossed the barrier of language to truly know her, to hear not just her words but her soul. And in doing so, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a love that echoed through generations and reminded everyone who heard their story that true love means being willing to learn, to change, to meet someone where they are, and to honor who they were before you met them. Their story lived on in the voices of their descendants, in the Russian words still spoken by children who had never seen Russia, in the cabin that stood strong in the mountains, and in the hearts of all who heard how the mountain man learned her language just to hear her voice. It was a testament to the power of love, the importance of truly listening, and the beauty that can emerge when two people from different worlds choose to build a bridge between them and walk across it together, hand in hand, speaking words of love in whatever language their hearts understand.